Parity seems to be at an all-time high in college hoops these days, which is why it shouldn't be surprising to see a 3-loss Gonzaga team remain in the top 15 of the AP poll.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and if you win, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, the Zags remain a top 15 team in the AP poll. Only one game remaining is against a ranked team, though. We're going to discuss that, why UCLA is lower in the rankings than they probably should be, what still being in the top 15 means for the Zags. Plus, we got a handful of mailbag questions, 6 of them in total to answer between segments 2 and 3. We're discussing Graham Ike's role, Gonzaga's slow starts, their struggles in the month of December the last couple of weeks, or couple of years, I should say, all that and more to get to in today's jam-packed episode. Let's start talking about the AP poll. The Zags come in at number 13 in the polls this week. 5 spots dropped. They were at number 8 last week, coming off of that loss to the Kentucky Wildcats. They only played one game last week, the 6-point loss to the UConn Huskies at the Madison Square Garden. That loss, again, in a vacuum, not too terrible. We talked about that. Of course, 2 straight losses is never good, and it's very rare for Gonzaga. So I know that there's a lot of stress around that. A 7-3 start is not what many folks anticipated, but it's also worth acknowledging that Gonzaga is 7-3, having played a very challenging schedule, one of the hardest in all of college basketball. And B, there's just not a whole bunch of 0-1 loss teams in college hoops this year. Part of it is that a lot of these teams have played challenging schedules. There was a lot of the best teams in college basketball were in things like the Maui Invitational and the Players Era Festival and other events where there was just a lot of losses. We've seen a lot of really high-profile teams playing very rigorous non-conference schedules. Purdue, Marquette, Alabama, Creighton are a few that just come to mind off the top of my head who've played some really tough schedules. And so you just have a lot of teams that have 2, 3, 4 losses that are realistically some of the better teams in college basketball. And I think we're not going to go down a full huge tangent here, but the rise of computer metrics and analytics and just how we evaluate teams in a sport that's very difficult because there's 364 Division I teams, and every team through 10 or 11 games has played just a wildly different strength of schedule. And I think we've gotten so much better at being able to really assess and evaluate, hey, this team may have more losses than this team, but they've played a tougher schedule. The results are they lost to this team by only 2 or whatever it may be. And I think we shouldn't just look at the computer metrics and say, well, they all say Gonzaga is this good, so therefore they must be this good. Like you can't just take it at face value. There's some assessment there. And obviously Gonzaga, all these games were winnable, but at the end of the day, they've played 10 games, 3 of them they didn't win. Like there's nothing you can say to explain away the fact that they are 7-3. That is the reality of the situation. But expecting a 7-3 Gonzaga team to be outside the top 20 or towards the bottom half of the top 25, like looking at the rest of the sport, evaluating every team, it's pretty clear this is still one of the 15 or so best teams in college basketball. So I'm not surprised to see them sitting at 13 in the poll. I mentioned their strength of schedule. It is 12th, according to KenPom, the 12th hardest non-conference strength of schedule at this point in the season. Obviously, they have 2 bye games coming up with Nichols and Bucknell, but then they got another great game against UCLA after that. So certainly been that kind of non-conference slate for Mark Few and the Zags. That's what he wanted to do. That's what he likes to do. Obviously, he's not happy being in 7-3, but again, 7-3 in a season where you've played this kind of schedule is certainly different than 7-3, it would have been in 2008, or 2004 or whatever, where at that point they're probably not even being considered a likely NCAA tournament team. And now this team is still, at that level, just because, not just from reputation, but because the numbers, the analytics, everything really back up this team still being among the best of the best. Your top 5 didn't change except Kentucky and Duke flipping spots. Tennessee's 1, Auburn's 2, Iowa State's 3, Kentucky's 4, Duke is 5. Bama comes in at number 6, Florida 7, Kansas 8, Marquette is 9, Oregon is top 10. We're going to talk about Oregon and UCLA here in a second. But again, for the Zags, KenPom still has them 6th. It's a slight drop from where they were previously, but 6th is still pretty darn good for the Zags. Their offense is still the second best offense in the country. Their defense is dropped a little bit. It's 21st still in the country, so it's still a very, very good defensive team. Obviously, a great offensive team. We know that. Looking at the teams ahead of them in terms of records, there's only 2 teams ahead of Gonzaga that don't have a loss yet. That would be Tennessee and Florida. The SEC has been really killing it this year. There's a couple of one-loss teams ahead of them, Auburn, Iowa State, and Kentucky, who are all in the top 5. And then Oregon at number 10 is a one-loss team. And then Duke, Bama, Kansas, Marquette, Texas A&M, all of those teams that are ahead of them have 2 losses. And there's one 3-loss team ahead of them. That is, of course, Dan Hurley's UConn Huskies, who very justifiably moved ahead of Gonzaga in the AP poll. Wins are what matters. Gonzaga's got good wins. Some of their wins people are a little concerned about. I understand that. We're not sure what Arizona State's going to look like. Baylor is a team that is not in the top 25 right now. I think Baylor's going to figure it out, and I think that win's going to be just fine for Gonzaga going forward. I think they ultimately do end up being a top 25 team. San Diego State is a top 25 team, and I think we'll hang on to that spot. They've done a lot of great stuff this year, and that's still without Reese Waters, their star player from last year, who is expected to return later this month. But there's still some pressure on that UCLA game. We're going to talk about that more a little later in the show, but yeah, there's some pressure on Gonzaga to win that game, pick up another quality win. St. Mary's is no longer in the poll. They're no longer receiving any votes after an overtime loss to Boise State. It's a little bit harsh, but having said that, I wouldn't have ranked St. Mary's at this point either. I think there's the problem for Gonzaga is the best way for St. Mary's to get back into the top 25, which helps the Zags, is if St. Mary's beats Gonzaga, which does not help them. So hopefully St. Mary's can beat Washington State, beat San Francisco, do enough potentially with some of those wins to get themselves back in the top 25, which helps Gonzaga. But ultimately the net ranking is what really matters. It's not necessarily where you are in the AP poll. That helps more with public perception and whatnot. But the net still really loves Gonzaga. We said KenPom has Gonzaga 6th, and we're talking about computer metrics. The net still has Gonzaga at 4. They're a 4th ranked team in the net rankings. Again, we'll see. They're not going to hold on to that. They don't have as many quad 1 opportunities left, but a huge part of Gonzaga's success this year has been the strength of their schedule. They're 2-3 in quad 1 games. Obviously, you'd like to have more wins and less losses in the quad 1 at that point, but 5 of the 10 games Gonzaga has played this season are quad 1 games. Think about that. Last year, Gonzaga was hunting for their first quad 1 game and didn't get it till February. This year, they've already played 5 quad 1 games. They've already won 2 of them. Mark Few did a tremendous job of putting together a schedule that allows this team to be competitive and frankly allows this team to fail without it being this huge, devastating, problematic thing in terms of how they're going to be evaluated in March. That doesn't mean that them losing is not bad and that it is not bad in terms of morale on the team and in terms of like, hey, we have issues that we need to fix if we want to get back to where we're capable of being, if we want to continue the Sweet 16 streak, if we want to do that stuff. So I'm not saying, oh, well, they scheduled a hard schedule, so it's fine that they have 3 losses. That's not exactly what I mean. I'm just saying it is something that is helping this team still be viewed very positively by metrics that, again, the Selection Sunday Committee highly value when assessing where a team should be seated in the big dance. Wanted to talk quickly about UCLA before we move on to the mailbag portion of the show. The Bruins are at 18th in the AP poll right now. Oregon is at 10th, and that just doesn't make any sense to me. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Head-to-head should not be the only way to evaluate where teams are in the polls. Clemson shouldn't be ahead of Kentucky, for example. There's others. That's just one that comes straight to my mind. But Oregon lost to UCLA at home. UCLA went on the road and beat the Ducks. That's a fact. It is a factual statement that UCLA has a win over Oregon. It is Oregon's only loss so far this season. UCLA's only loss came in the second game of the season in the first week, and it was against New Mexico in a neutral site. New Mexico's not a great team. That is a worse loss than Oregon's loss, which of course is to UCLA. So I can understand that. And Oregon has some great wins. Don't get me wrong. Oregon has some really good wins with what they did in the Players Era Festival. But there's nothing that points to me thinking Oregon should be that much higher than UCLA. Oregon being a top 10 team while UCLA only moved up a few spots to 18 just doesn't make sense to me. UCLA beat Arizona and Phoenix. I know Arizona's really struggling this year, but that's still a good win to beat Arizona in a pseudo home environment for the Wildcats. They beat Washington. They beat Oregon. This team's 9-1, like we said. KenPom has UCLA at 13th and Oregon at 19th. The net has UCLA at 13th and Oregon at 17th. And yet UCLA is 8 spots behind Oregon in the rankings. That's just a little bit of the soapbox I'm going to go on there. I'm not exactly a UCLA fan, as most Gonzaga people are not, but we would like to see UCLA as high in the rankings as they're capable of being before facing them in a couple of weeks. Good news for Gonzaga fans is UCLA takes on North Carolina this Saturday, and then, of course, Gonzaga next Saturday. If UCLA goes out and beats North Carolina at the Madison Square Garden, they're going to be potentially, for sure, a top 15 team, potentially a top 10 team by the time that game rolls around at the end of the month. Well, December has been rough for the Zags the past couple of years. We're going to discuss what that means about this team and more coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, it is that time of year. The college football playoff is back. And with the newly expanded 12-team format, it is guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting and high-flying excitement that you love. TNT Sports coverage of the college football playoff begins December 21st, starting with the college football playoff kickoff show presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern time, leading into our first matchup, the SMU Mustangs taking on the Penn State Nittany Lions at noon. Then the Clemson Tigers out of the ACC looking to upset the Texas Longhorns in a showdown starting at 4 p.m. Eastern. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch the college football playoffs presented by Allstate live on TNT, TBS, True TV, and Max. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're closing out the show with 2 more segments discussing some mailbag questions submitted. As a reminder, if you want to get involved in Mailbag Monday, you can join the Discord channel, Locked On Zags Discord. There's a link in the show notes. Click the link. It'll get you invited in. It's free to join. There's over 400 Gonzaga fans literally chatting about the Zags every single day on a free platform. What more could you possibly want? It's fantastic. There's a section in there to submit your mailbag questions. This first question comes from Austin via Discord. Austin says, yes, we are now 7-3, but I feel like this year those losses are fixable. Last year we were straight up outmatched. Thoughts? Kind of. Like, I agree in some ways, and I sort of disagree in other ways. It's not quite as simple as this, as few things are quite that black and white, but I think last year's team lacked depth and didn't have as much overall talent on the roster, and those were unfixable issues. The Zags could not add players to the roster in the middle of the season, so they were unable to do anything about the fact that they didn't really have a backup point guard, that their depth in the backcourt was really significantly problematic. Like that is completely something I agree with, whereas this year's team, that is not the issue. They have more depth. They have more talent on this roster. They're 9, 10, 11 guys. Emmanuel Innocente, Jun-Suk Yo, Ismaila Diani. They don't play much. They don't play much in these games. Innocente's gotten a little bit of run, but that's a more talented group there at the bottom than it was on last year's team. They have Mike Lejayi and Caliph Battle. Obviously, they lose Anton Watson, but there's still more talent and depth on this roster. So I would completely agree with that. But a lot of what has been a challenge for Gonzaga this year, particularly in the second half against Kentucky, particularly in both halves against UConn, a lot in the second half as well, was that Gonzaga's offense was operating as it should. And I think that's what's so frustrating. It's what's frustrating for the players. It's what's frustrating for the coaching staff. It's what's frustrating for you and I as fans of this team watching them, is that they were running sets to get Graham Ike looks around the basket, or Braden Huff looks around the basket, or when they were playing their zone offense, they were running plays. I think they still need to work on their zone offense. Don't get me wrong, but there were many opportunities against Kentucky and UConn where they got the shot they wanted. They got Graham Ike isolated on the block. They got Braden Huff a look over his right shoulder with his left hand. They got Nolan Hickman a wide open 3. They got Ben Gregg like whatever it was, and they just missed them. That is insanely frustrating. And on one hand, yes, those things are fixable. Good players are not just going to continue to miss shots they don't typically miss. Like, that's not going to happen. As much as we're grubbing about Graham Ike, he's still shooting about 50% on 2-pointers on the season. That's about where he was last year. I know it feels like he's missing way more shots, but from a percentage perspective, he's not. He's taking less shots. The foul, like, there's other stuff with Graham. We'll get into it. But at the end of the day, like, players who typically make a certain percentage of shots, it's probably going to even out. They're probably not going to dramatically drop 15 percentage points in their field goal percentage. So, like, you can expect that, oh, that guy had a bad game, it's probably going to come back around. But when you're a coach and you're running the stuff that you want to run and you're getting the players open, you're getting the things that you want, or defensively, the amount of times in that UConn game where Gonzaga played great defense and then solo ball chucked up a disgusting 3-pointer that somehow went in, or Jalen Stewart was like falling on the floor, flinging the ball over his shoulder and it's going in. Like, those things happen. They happen in close games. They happen to teams in losses. It's just one of those things that happens. And for Gonzaga, when you run good defense and you hold a team like UConn to 21% from three, or Kentucky, who didn't shoot it well from three, like, they had defensive issues in the second half of that game. But for the most part, a lot of what's happened in those couple of games is Gonzaga doing what they need to do, getting the looks, getting the executing in the way that they're expected to, and the result is not following suit. That's really frustrating. And it doesn't mean that the coach is absolved of all issues. Some people accuse me of being too not hard enough on Mark Few. There's problems. And we're going to talk about them in a second with the struggles in the first and the start of the first half, the start of the second half. That's a coaching issue. We'll talk about that. But ultimately, I think a lot of the challenge with saying that some of Gonzaga's issues this year are fixable are that I don't know what you do to fix guys missing shots they normally make. Like, it's mental in some ways. And maybe that's where some of the issues are, is like, how do we figure out how to get past these blocks? Are guys playing scared? Are guys lacking confidence? Is there, issues with camaraderie or things like that? I don't know or think any of that. I'm not trying to make any accusations or anything, but you start to wonder, like, hey, if we're doing the stuff we're supposed to be doing, if we're working hard in practice, we're doing all these good things, and it's not coming through in the game, we need to figure out what the heck's going on. So I don't know that the issues are as fixable as we hope that they are, but I will say that the last year's team didn't have the depth and were outmatched in a lot of the games they lost. This year's team, I don't feel like that's the case. So that's a long-winded way of saying, yeah, I generally agree. It's just not quite that simple. Next two questions in the segment here come from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff said, what is going on with Gonzaga in the month of December the last couple of years? Yeah, just playing tougher games. Really, the only game in December the last 2 years that the Zags lost that felt really rough was the loss at Washington, a team that wasn't very good. Gonzaga lost 3 games in December last year. They lost to San Diego State at home, and that was a bad loss. That was a tough loss. It didn't ultimately end up being like a super bad loss from a metrics perspective, but you never like to lose at home. So that one was tough. Obviously, the UConn loss at Climate Pledge Arena was tough. But this year, it's like, yeah, they're 0-2 in December. That feels really uncomfortable because we're not used to it. But they've lost to a top 5 team in Kentucky, and they lost to what's probably going to end up being a top 10 team in UConn. They're just playing good teams. And last year, they didn't play as many good teams in November, so they didn't lose very many games. And then this year, they played better teams in November, so they had more losses, but also had a better resume, they had 1 loss in November this year as West Virginia, not one of the better teams they've played, but they're more equipped to handle those tough losses. I don't think it's any more complicated than they're playing tough teams in December. And I think for Gonzaga, they, like most teams in college basketball, they've typically scheduled a handful of bye games early in the season to kind of assess your roster, figure out your rotations, kind of get players who are new to the system, new to the team, or even just new to their role, kind of figure out what you want them to look like, what you want them to do. And then in December, you're kind of rolling. For Gonzaga, last year, it took longer than that because they didn't play a super competitive schedule in the start of the season. And the games they played that were good were in Maui, and Maui was just a complete crapshoot. With 3 games in 3 days, it's hard to make a lot of adjustments or make any kind of changes to your lineup. So I think for Gonzaga, they came in December still reeling a little bit, still trying to figure out who they were, and that led to some losses. This year, I think Gonzaga played some really great games early in the year. They played some really tough teams, and then they just came into December and played really good teams. Again, I think trying to make it more than what it is, it's just Gonzaga losing to 2 of the 10 best teams in the country. One of them, maybe not a top 10 team right now, but the back-to-back national champions, and you played them at a pseudo home environment, place that they rarely lose. I just think it looking at it from a bigger scope doesn't really help. It was 2 really good teams that Gonzaga had a chance to win, and they didn't. Final question of the segment comes from Jeff. He says, during the game against UConn, Gonzaga was outscored 13-2 during the first 3 minutes of the game and was outscored 13-5 during the first 3 minutes of the second half. What is the deal with slow starts to start games or coming out of the halftime break? Yeah, this is the most frustrating part of the Gonzaga loss to UConn. In the 6 minutes of action, effectively, give or take a minute or so, Gonzaga was outscored by 19. 26 points for UConn in those 2 runs. Gonzaga had 7, 19 points. Gonzaga lost this game by 6, which means that for the other 34 minutes of basketball, that were played at Madison Square Garden on Saturday, Gonzaga outscored UConn by 6. By 13, by 13. So basically for 34 of the 40 minutes against UConn, Gonzaga won by 13 and they lose by 6 because of 2 3-minute stretches. That is outrageously frustrating. I mean, it is. In terms of what it means, we talked about it a little bit earlier. It's adjustments, and some of that falls on the coaching staff. But again, let's take the Kentucky game, for example. I know we're talking about UConn, but let's take the Kentucky game, for example. Gonzaga did everything right in the first half of that game. The defense was great. The offense was great. They were humming along. Graham Ike had 20-plus points in the first half. Everything was going super smoothly. At halftime, you're not going to make a bunch of adjustments. There's small things I'm sure that they adjusted or they tweaked or things they wanted to do differently, but you're kind of having to be reactive to what Kentucky does. This isn't a team, you scouted them as much as you can, but you're not exactly sure what Mark Pope and Kentucky are going to do with the personnel that they have, and they come out with that zone defense, and it took Gonzaga longer than it should have to adjust to the zone and figure out what they wanted to do, and that is on Mark Few, that is on the coaching staff. I believe that strongly, but at the end of the day, the Zags had to be reactionary to that. And I think that's what happened a little bit against UConn, is they weren't expecting what UConn did early in that game, and they should have been. Again, that's a coaching thing that I think was frustrating to see. But the Zags ran a great play to get Michael Ajayi an open look immediately. They clearly had some stuff up their sleeve, but once they just got blitzed very quickly, they called the timeout, they composed themselves, and they won the rest of the first half. But then adjustments in the second half were not made at a way that I think Gonzaga needed to make them. I'm not a coach. I can't tell you every specific thing they could have, should have, would have done in the second half that they didn't do, but they got smoked at the start of the second half after getting smoked at the start of the first half. That's really frustrating. And to win a game for 34 of the 40 minutes and never feel like you actually had a chance of winning the basketball game, there's got to be some soul searching, some introspection, some work done by the coaching staff and the players too. Again, a lot of the shots in that second half were exactly what the offense was designed to do, and they just weren't making them. Mark Few can't make the players make shots. He can do everything else, but he can't make them make the shots. But at the end of the day, getting crushed by 19 points in 2 3-minute stretches is a problem that the coaching staff needs to figure out how to adjust, because that just cannot continue to happen for this team to be at the level they want to be at. Well, folks, after another problematic performance, we got to start to wonder what the Zags are going to do with Graham Ike. We're going to discuss that and more to close out the show coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, get ready to tackle the college hoops action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and you will get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets all in one place. So when you get a hunt in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. Little WCC Future Pac-12 action on Tuesday night. Tonight, Oregon State hosts a team that many think could end up being in the Pac-12 with Oregon State and Gonzaga. That is Sacramento State. Game is tonight in Corvallis. The Beavers are favored by 19.5. Gives you a little indication of where Sac State is as a men's basketball program. I'm going to be tuning into this game. If you want to tune in with me, you want to toss some money down, just visit FanDuel.com to join today. As a reminder, you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. Today's episode is also brought to you by Prize Picks. Folks, make your holidays bigger and brighter with Prize Picks, the best place to get real money action while watching your favorite sports. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money using Prize Picks. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app. Join now, because this holiday season, Prize Picks is giving away 2 free picks in December, and they're giving away $30+ million in rewards during Pixmas. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDON to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We got 3 more mailbag questions to get to. This first one comes from Chuck via Gmail. Chuck says, don't you think it's time to have Ike come off the bench? He doesn't look like he has the fire to play this year. Oh boy, Chuck, I hate to do this to you, but I have one of my biggest pet peeves is when fans or people watching the game make assessments or judgments or assumptions about a player's mental fortitude, their desire, their fire, their energy, their enthusiasm, anything like that based on what you're watching on TV, absolutely despise it. Graham Ike is not playing well. We've said that. We'll continue to say it. We'll continue to talk about it. We're going to answer the question here. But this is a man who watches more film than anybody Mark Few has ever coached. He is one of the most passionate people ever. Watch him he is very energetic. The idea that he does not have the fire to play this year, especially when 10 days ago he scored 28 points against the best defensive player in the country, something I continue to repeat because I think it bears repeating that Graham Ike, when he is playing at his best, is still that flipping dude for Gonzaga. We got to keep talking about it because he's still that guy. He just has not delivered most of the time this year, and it is insanely frustrating. And I doubt anybody is more frustrated about Graham Ike's inconsistency this year than Graham Ike, and any kind of assessment or assumption that he is not as motivated or passionate or fired up as he typically is just because he's not making as many shots. You got to miss me with that. It's one of my least favorite things. Having said all of that, the idea about whether to start Graham or start Braden Huff is a lot more complicated than just who's playing better, who's been playing better the last 10 games, 5 games, 8 games. Like, Mark Few doesn't just willy-nilly change the starting lineup based on who's been playing better or who's not been. And that's been a challenge for him because they did make an early switch in the starting lineup with Ben Gregg and Michael Ajayi. And now that has kind of switched. Now, Michael had a good game against UConn, which I think is very good for the Zags going forward. But like, you can't just be like, all right, now in the last 5 games, Ben's been playing better than Michael, so we'll switch it. Okay, in the next 5 games, like, you can't do that. You can, but again, we're not playing NBA Live. Like, these are real people with real emotions. And if they're playing scared or playing tentative or playing not sure if they make a mistake, if they're going to get yanked or they're going to lose their starting spot, you're causing your team problems. I'm also not somebody who particularly concerns myself with who starts, but rather who finishes games and who's playing more minutes. Graham Ike is playing about like 18, 19 minutes per game. If you take out the Kentucky game where he played a bunch, and I think if you take out the San Diego State game, or even just take out the Kentucky game, he played 35 minutes against Kentucky. You take that game out, Graham Ike is averaging like 17 minutes a game. Braden Huff's playing more than that. So to me, Braden Huff's playing more than Graham Ike. Graham Ike is used to being the starter. Braden Huff's used to coming off the bench. That's not a change I make unless I feel it's going to work, and I don't have the ability to make that assessment. Mark Few does. If Mark Few believes that benching Graham Ike, telling him, hey, we're going to bring you off the bench, we're going to make a switch here, if he believes that's going to motivate him, that is going to have a positive intended result on his performance and on Braden Huff's performance, then you do it. But if he thinks it's going to have a negative, either Braden won't be ready for the pressure of the starting lineup, or Graham is not going to handle it well and he's going to put more pressure on himself and it's going to make him play worse, then you don't do it. I don't know which of those two things is more likely to be the reality of the situation, but I have a feeling that our coach does. And I trust him to make that assessment. Again, if Graham was playing way more minutes than Braden this season, we'd be having a different conversation. I don't care that Graham starts over Braden if Braden plays more minutes and if Mark Few rolls with the hot hand. When Graham struggled earlier this year, when he struggled in that game again, he's played 12 minutes in this game against UConn and against, I think it was the West Virginia game or the Indiana, one of the games that they played, he played like 12 minutes or 13 minutes in that game too. I think Arizona State, he didn't play much. Like, when he's not playing well, Mark Few hasn't had any problem benching him for huge stretches of the game. I would rather him do that than make a change to the starting lineup unless he thinks it's going to be a positive for the team going forward. 2 more questions to get to, both from Jeff. Jeff says, agree or disagree, Gonzaga needs a win over UCLA in order to have a shot at a 2 or 3 seed in March. If the Zags lose the game against UCLA, the ceiling could be a 4 seed. Disagree. No, I think that's making a lot of wild assumptions about how the entire rest of college basketball is going to go. And I think the idea of Gonzaga, who already has 2 quad 1 wins, who got a 5 seed last year despite not picking up a quad 1 win till February, who is playing, still has already played 5 quad 1 games, will play at least 2 more, because the road game against St. Mary's for sure will be. This game against UCLA will be. There's realistically 3, maybe 4 more quad 1 games, depending what happens with St. Mary's and San Francisco. The fact that every other team in college basketball is losing games left and right, the SEC is going to beat the heck out of each other. The idea to me that Gonzaga losing to UCLA limits their ceiling to a 4 seed, no. It's not 2010 anymore. This Gonzaga team has such a strong schedule such a power in the analytics right now. Love them. And again, I keep bringing up the analytics. You don't have to like analytics, dear listener, if that's not your thing. But I bring it up because the Selection Sunday Committee heavily values it. They value the net ranking. They value KenPom. They value Torvik, which is now part of their sheets. If Gonzaga continues to show up as a top 10 team in those rankings, again, they're not going to get a 1 seed. If they lose to UCLA, I wouldn't be surprised if 2 seed is highly unlikely. But I say it's impossible. To say a 3 seed's impossible? Nah, I think it's definitely within the realm of possibility. Harder if they don't beat UCLA, certainly. But I wouldn't say that their ceiling is capped at a 4 seed with a loss to the Bruins. Final question of the show from Jeff. For the past month, since November 15th, Gonzaga has played only 1 home game and 6 away from home, with 5 of them being neutral site games. Could the sustained games away from home have something to do with Gonzaga's recent struggles? Yep. Yes, they could. I don't have a whole lot more to add to that. I assume it is a factor. It's human nature to struggle to adjust to being in a new place, to adjust to playing in a different arena, time zone differences, traveling, being away from your family, from your friends, from your partner, living in hotel rooms. Like it's just more difficult. It's just more difficult. I'm not saying that they're soft for that or that it's like a significant problem for the team. I think it hopefully has built some fortitude and has put them in a position to be more prepared for March and more prepared for the rest of the season. But to pretend that only playing 1 home game in the last literal month exactly isn't having some kind of impact on this team, it certainly is. It certainly is. Just like I think finals week had an impact on the Zags not showing up for that UConn game. Again, is that a excuse where we just say, oh, well, it was finals week, so it's fine that they lost? No, of course not. You still got to hold them accountable. You still got to hold them responsible for not winning the game, but it is a factor. It is again, they're not playing a video game. They're real people playing real basketball with real emotions and real struggles outside of the game. And so I think playing a bunch of games away from home, dealing with finals week does make things a little bit harder for them. But at the end of the day, if you want to win a national championship, you have to be able to fight through those battles. And this team didn't pass that test this last week. Haven't passed that test yet in December. They got 2 home games now to right the ship, to get themselves back on track, go out, win yourself a big game against UCLA, get into conference play with a little momentum, knock off St. Mary's a couple times, and bam, you're right back in that conversation, in that 3-4 seed conversation, at least going into the NCAA tournament. Going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Had fun with this one. Thanks so much for all the questions. Looking forward to our show on Wednesday, where we're going to get you ready for that game against Nicholls State. We'll recap the game on Thursday, then we'll get you ready for that Bucknell game coming our way on Saturday. Then, of course, the big one the next week against UCLA, a little after Christmas. Lots of fun stuff still here in the month of December for Zags and for Locked On Zags. Want to thank all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Remind you to join the Discord channel if you haven't yet. Thanks again, folks. We'll be back with a fun show for you on Wednesday, getting you ready for that night's game. Until then, as always, go Zags.